You don't deserve a single cent of bonus." Blair Whitmore pushed the compensation sheet across the table at Gavin Mercer in front of the entire leadership team. He had just spent 6 weeks saving the firm's largest contract, but Blair smirked and told him a single father should be grateful he still had a paycheck. Nobody spoke. Gavin closed his folder, stood, and walked out. Before the elevator doors shut, his phone rang. The screen showed the name of the CEO of Blair's biggest rival. He wanted Gavin immediately. But why? Whitmore Meridian Group occupied 11 floors of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, and for 8 years, Gavin Mercer had worked on the 33rd of them, in an office that faced an air shaft. He had never asked for a better view, never lobbied for a seat closer to the executive floor, never volunteered for the photographs that ran in the trade press. He had never once tried to make himself the story. What he had done instead was answer his phone. Inside the firm, there was a phrase that had hardened into reflex. When a major client called at 7 in the morning threatening to walk, when a project stalled and 3 departments started drafting memos to protect themselves, when a managing director ran out of explanations in the middle of a board presentation, someone always said the same 6 words: "Get Mercer on the call." He was not the loudest strategist at Whitmore Meridian, and he was not the fastest with a deck. What Gavin had was a memory for promises other people had forgotten making. He remembered the offhand commitment a partner had given 18 months earlier and never logged. He remembered which executive at a client company had staked his own reputation on a timeline and what it would cost that man personally if the timeline slipped. He could look at a set of beautiful numbers and see the ugly thing sitting behind them, and he could sit across from a furious client and rebuild trust one verifiable commitment at a time. That skill had never made him famous. It had only made him necessary, which in a firm like Whitmore Meridian was a very different thing. 3 months before the meeting on the 41st floor, Holston Aviation had nearly ended its relationship with the firm. Holston was the largest client Whitmore Meridian had, contributing close to 1/4 of annual revenue, and a failed transformation project had pushed their general counsel into using the word termination in writing. It was not the kind of loss that dented a quarter. It was the kind that reset a company's entire valuation story. Blair Whitmore did not handle it herself. She called Gavin into her office on a Tuesday afternoon, did not sit down, and did not ask whether he had the capacity to take it on. She gave him the account with 3 instructions delivered in under a minute. Fix it fast, and do not let it become a scandal. He took it, the way he always took it. The 6 weeks that followed were the hardest of his professional life. Gavin flew to Holston's operations center twice in the first 10 days and sat in a windowless conference room with 3 departments that had spent 4 months building careful paper trails against each other. He made each of them say out loud, in front of the others, what they had actually committed to and what had actually been delivered. He never raised his voice. He simply refused to leave the room until the record was honest. Then, he rebuilt the plan from the foundation. He rewrote the governance structure so that every deliverable carried one name rather than a committee. He cut the reporting package from 60 pages to 9, on the theory that a client who has already been disappointed does not want volume, and put a weekly call on the calendar that he ran himself every single time without sending a substitute. He was in the office before 6 most mornings, and still answering Holston's questions after 9 most nights. And slowly, in increments invisible to anyone watching from outside, he earned back something the firm had spent a year burning through. By the end of the 6th week, Holston Aviation agreed to renew. The consequences arrived cleanly. Whitmore Meridian hit its quarterly revenue target. The firm's largest client stayed. Gavin cleared every performance metric in his file, and under the compensation formula the firm had used since before he joined, he was owed the largest bonus of his 8 years there. He did not celebrate it. He sent no firm-wide note, let his name circulate in no internal newsletter, and when a junior colleague congratulated him in the elevator, he said the client had made the decision, not him. What Gavin allowed himself was something quieter and, in the end, more dangerous. He allowed himself to believe that after 8 years of showing up, the company was finally about to say out loud what he was worth. The quarterly performance review was scheduled for the 41st floor. He had been in that conference room perhaps a dozen times in 8 years, always as the person brought in to explain a client's situation, never as the subject. The table was long and pale, and the windows ran the full length of the room, and from that height the avenue below looked like a diagram of itself. Blair sat at the head. Miles Prescott, the chief financial officer, sat at her right with a leather folder squared in front of him. Dana Whitlock from Human Resources took the seat near the door, and 4 vice presidents filled in the rest. Blair opened by talking about Holston Aviation, and for the first 2 minutes, Gavin thought it was going to be simple. She called the retention the most significant outcome of the quarter. She said the firm had entered the period facing a real possibility of losing its anchor client and had come out with a renewed contract and a revenue target met. She was precise and persuasive, and the vice presidents nodded the way people nod at good news. Then she called it a team achievement. She said the recovery reflected the depth of the Whitmore Meridian platform, the strength of its methodology, the quality of the institution, rather than any one individual. She thanked the delivery organization. She thanked the account operations group. Somewhere inside that construction, without anyone in the room appearing to notice, Gavin's name stopped existing. He sat still and let her finish. Blair slid the compensation sheet across the table toward him. Gavin looked down at the page. He was good with numbers, and it did not take him long. The base was unchanged. The performance rating sat at the top of the scale, which he registered with something close to bitterness, because it meant nobody was even pretending his work had been deficient. And the bonus line, the number that 8 years and 6 weeks and 1/4 of the firm's annual revenue had earned him, had been reduced to something so small it read as an insult rather than a payment. He asked his question calmly because that was the only way he knew how to ask questions in rooms like that one. He said he wanted to understand which metric had produced the change. Blair answered without looking at the sheet. Executive discretion. Gavin said that he had cleared every performance metric in his file and that Holston Aviation was the reason the firm had reported the quarter it reported. He was not arguing. He was doing what he had done in every difficult room of his career, which was to lay the verifiable facts on the table and let them sit there. But the facts were sitting in front of 4 vice presidents, a chief financial officer, and the head of human resources, and that was the part Blair could not tolerate. Her voice changed. She pushed the paper back across the table hard enough that it slid past his hands. "You don't deserve a single cent a bonus." The room went completely silent. Miles Prescott did not move. Dana Whitlock kept her eyes on her folder. One of the vice presidents reached for a glass of water and then decided against it. Somewhere down the table, a pen was set down very carefully, as though the sound itself might be held against whoever made it. Blair was not finished. She told him he had a salary. She told him he had health coverage and a stable position at a firm with a name that opened doors. She said it the way people say things they have rehearsed without knowing they rehearsed them. And then she arrived at the sentence that would follow Gavin out of the building and through everything that came afterward. She said that a single father in his situation ought to understand that stability was worth more than a few numbers on a compensation sheet. Gavin did not react the way she expected. He did not raise his voice, and he did not stand up. He asked her one more question, in the same even tone he had used for the first. If Holston counted when the firm reported its revenue, why did it disappear when the firm calculated what it owed the person who saved it? She looked at him for a moment. and when she answered, her voice had gone flat and cold, stripped of the performance she had been giving for the room. "Don't confuse being useful with being irreplaceable." Nobody defended him. That was the part Gavin would think about later, in the elevator and in the hours after. Not the sentence about the bonus, which was cruelty, and not the sentence about stability, which was calculation. The silence. Miles Prescott had sat across from him at 40 client meetings and watched him hold accounts together, and Miles would not meet his eyes. Dana Whitlock, whose entire function in that building was process and fairness, studied her folder as though the answer were printed in it. The vice presidents said nothing at all. They were not shocked. That was what the silence told him. They were embarrassed, which is a different reaction, and embarrassment meant none of them believed the outcome could be changed. Gavin understood then that this had stopped being about money somewhere in the last 4 minutes. Money was a number, and numbers could be renegotiated. What the room had just handed him was an appraisal. After 8 years, the company had told him exactly, to the dollar, how much it thought he was worth. And the answer was that it thought he could be told anything at all and would still come back on Monday. He signed the acknowledgement line at the bottom of the sheet, capped his pen, squared the folder in front of him, and left the room without another word. Behind him, the meeting resumed. Blair told Miles, in a tone that carried more than she intended, that Gavin would settle down by the end of the week. Men like that always did. He would go home, look at his obligations, remember what a stable position was worth in a market like this one, and by Monday he would be back on his calls. He needs the stability too much to actually walk. Gavin heard none of it. He was standing in the elevator lobby on the 41st floor with the folder under his arm, watching the floor indicator, and what surfaced in his mind was not the compensation sheet at all. It was a lunch 6 months earlier. Warren Beckett ran Beckett North and Pierce, the firm that competed with Whitmore Meridian on nearly every major account in the market, and he had asked Gavin to meet him at a restaurant far enough uptown that neither of them would be seen. Warren had not opened with flattery. He had opened by describing in detail 2 situations Gavin had handled in the previous 3 years, including specifics Gavin had assumed nobody outside the client's building knew. Then Warren made the offer. Vice President of Strategic Accounts, a higher base, a guaranteed bonus rather than a discretionary one, the authority to build his own team, chosen by him, and, in Warren's words, a title that matched the responsibility instead of trailing 3 years behind it. Gavin turned it down. He turned it down because he had spent 8 years building something at Whitmore Meridian that felt like it belonged to him. Because leaving felt like conceding that the loyalty had been a mistake, and because some part of him still believed the institution would eventually settle its accounts with the people who carried it. He said all of that, badly, over coffee, and Warren did not argue. Warren said only one thing before they left the restaurant. "The offer stays open until you find out what your loyalty is actually worth." Standing in that lobby, Gavin took out his phone and scrolled back 6 months to a message thread he had never deleted. He typed 2 words. "Still open?" The reply did not come as a message. His phone rang before a minute had passed, and the screen showed Warren Beckett's name, and Gavin answered it in the elevator lobby of the firm that had just told him he was worth nothing. Beckett, North and Pierce had never stopped wanting him. Warren said it without any particular drama, the way a man states a fact he has been holding for half a year. He gave the terms on the call. A base roughly 35% above what Whitmore Meridian paid him. A first-year bonus guaranteed in writing, rather than left to anyone's discretion. Authority to build his own strategic team. The title was Vice President. The letter reached Gavin's phone before he had left the floor. He read it twice. Then he looked back down the corridor toward the conference room where, 40 minutes earlier, the chief executive of his company had told a table full of leadership that he did not deserve a single cent, and where not one person had said a word in his defense. He signed it standing in that corridor, against the wall beside the elevator call button, using the folder that still held the compensation sheet as a writing surface. When the elevator doors finally closed, Blair Whitmore's largest competitor had already snapped him up. She did not know it yet. She would spend the next several days believing she had won something, that she had saved a bonus line, protected an incentive pool, and demonstrated to a room full of executives that the chief executive's discretion was not a thing to be questioned in public. What Blair had actually done was hand one of the most valuable assets her firm owned to the one competitor who understood exactly what he was worth. Gavin submitted his formal resignation the next morning, before 9, with a written offer to complete a full handover of every account under his name. He did not send it to Blair alone. He copied Human Resources, because he had spent 8 years learning that in a firm like Whitmore Meridian, the only version of an event that survives is the documented one. Blair called him into her office within the hour. There was no apology. She did not begin by asking why, or by acknowledging anything that had been said on the 41st floor. She began from a position she had already decided was true, which was that this was a piece of theater. She had seen it before. People submitted resignations when they wanted their compensation revisited, and the correct response was to let them stand in the room long enough to feel the temperature of the water. She told him she was prepared to look at his number again next cycle if his performance held. Gavin took the Beckett North and Pierce offer letter out of his folder and set it on her desk, turned so she could read it. For the first time in 8 years, he watched something crack behind Blair Whitmore's composure. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. She read the title line and the base figure and the words "guaranteed first-year bonus," and then she put the page down and did the thing Gavin had known she would do, which was to reach for leverage instead of accountability. She started with what he would lose. 8 years of seniority, gone the moment he signed. The internal network he had spent nearly a decade building, worthless outside the building. The stability he supposedly valued so much, traded for a firm he had never worked at. His current position, which she pointed out had been protected through 2 rounds of restructuring, and the reputation, she said, that came from the Whitmore Meridian name rather than from him personally. When none of that moved him, she went to the last thing she had. She told him Warren Beckett did not actually want him. Warren wanted what he knew: 8 years of methodology and pricing structures and client histories and internal weaknesses, and the moment those had been extracted, Gavin would find himself managed out of a firm where he had no history and no protection. Gavin answered her without heat. He said Warren Beckett had made the offer 6 months ago, long before any conversation about a bonus had taken place, and that if the objective had been to extract information, there had been half a year in which to try. He added that she was welcome to verify the date, since the message thread was on a phone she had never had any interest in looking at until that morning. Blair had nothing to say to that. The handover that followed was the most careful piece of work Gavin had ever done at the firm, and he did it knowing exactly why. He took no client list. He forwarded no documents to a personal account. He copied nothing to any external drive and retained no material belonging to the firm. Everything he had built for Holston Aviation over 6 weeks was left inside the firm's systems, fully documented, with a transition memo that ran to 19 pages. He handed his laptop and his access credentials to the information technology group on his final afternoon and signed the acknowledgement they gave him. He was not being noble. He was being precise. He had understood, standing in that elevator lobby, that the moment he joined a competitor, everything he did would be examined by people looking for a reason, so he gave them nothing to find. Blair assigned Holston Aviation to Carter Voss, a young account executive she had been elevating for 2 years, bright and well-presented. The kind of person who performed extremely well in rooms where the difficult work had already been done. He received the 19-page memo, the full document repository, the governance structure Gavin had rebuilt, and the complete history of the account. What he did not receive, and what nobody could hand him, was 8 years of memory. He did not know that Holston's chief operating officer had personally staked his credibility on a delivery date under the previous administration, and that every conversation about timelines had to acknowledge that history before it could move forward. He did not know which of the 3 departments had been the source of the original failure, or that the fragile arrangement holding them together depended on commitments Gavin had extracted verbally in a windowless room. The failures were small at first, and that was what made them lethal. A call from Holston's operations lead went unreturned for 2 days. A deliverable slipped by a week, and the notification went out after the deadline rather than before it. The weekly call acquired a rotating cast of presenters, which told Holston that nobody at the firm considered it worth protecting. And a commitment from the previous quarter, one Gavin had made personally and logged in his own notes rather than the system, was raised by Holston and met with a blank response from Carter, who had never heard of it and said so honestly, which was somehow worse than an excuse. None of these were catastrophic. Together they communicated something no amount of methodology could correct, which was that the firm did not remember what it had promised. Holston's patience began to run out. Blair convened an emergency internal meeting, and in it she said something that would circulate through the firm for weeks afterward, delivered with the particular anger of someone defending a position she had begun to doubt. Gavin Mercer never ran this company. The reply came 4 days later, on a call with Holston Aviation's senior client representative, Ellis Crane, who had spent 11 years on the account side of the relationship and delivered it without any anger at all. "Maybe not," Ellis said, "but he seemed to be the only person over there who actually understood us." At Beckett North and Pierce, Warren Beckett did something that surprised Gavin. He kept him away from every former client. Not one Whitmore Meridian account. No introductions, no advisory role, no informal conversations. Warren was explicit about it in their first week, and his reasoning had nothing to do with legal exposure, though the legal exposure was real. He wanted an answer to a question, and he wanted it before anything else happened. Did Whitmore Meridian create Gavin Mercer, or had Gavin Mercer been creating value for Whitmore Meridian the entire time? So Warren gave him an account he had never touched, in an industry he had no history in, that was 6 weeks away from terminating its relationship with Beckett North and Pierce. No prior data, no existing relationships, no advantage of any kind. Only whatever Gavin actually was underneath 8 years of a logo. He worked it the only way he knew how. He went to their offices rather than asking them to come to his, and he spent the first 4 days asking questions instead of presenting anything, which the client had not expected from a consulting firm at that stage of a dispute. He put the real history of the relationship on the table in front of everyone who had helped create it. He rebuilt the governance so that each deliverable carried a single name. And in the 4th week, he found the thing that had actually broken the relationship, which was not a missed deadline at all, but a commitment made by a departed partner that nobody at Beckett had ever written down, and which the client had spent 9 months assuming was being ignored on purpose. The account stayed. Gavin sat in his new office afterward with a confirmation email open on his screen and felt something he had not expected, which was not triumph, but relief. For 8 years there had been a question underneath everything, quiet enough to ignore, which was whether he was good or whether he had simply been standing in a building with a good name on it. He had an answer now, and it belonged to him. Then Holston Aviation made a decision that moved through the industry within a single afternoon. They reopened the contract for competitive bid. the account that represented close to 1/4 of Whitmore Meridian's annual revenue, the account Gavin had saved 6 weeks before being told he did not deserve a single cent for saving it, was going back to market. 4 firms were invited to participate. One of them was Beckett, North and Pierce. Warren brought it to Gavin the same day and gave him an exit. He said nobody at the firm would think less of him if he stayed off the pursuit, that the conflict was obvious, and that there were people at Beckett who could run it without him. Gavin turned it down, but he set a condition on himself before accepting the work, and he put it in writing to Warren and to Beckett's general counsel the same day because he already understood what was coming. He would use only new information provided directly by Holston Aviation during the bid process. Nothing from Whitmore Meridian. Not a document, not a data point, not a recollection of internal pricing or internal weakness. If a fact could not be traced to something Holston handed him in the current process, it would not appear in the proposal. He wanted to win clean, and he wanted the record to show he had wanted it before there was any accusation to defend against. The accusation came within 11 days. When Blair learned that Gavin would lead the Beckett, North and Pierce proposal, something in her calculation shifted from confidence to something closer to panic, and she began constructing a story that explained everything without requiring her to have made a single error. The story was this. Gavin had planned his exit for months. The bonus dispute had been a pretext, staged in front of leadership to create a narrative of grievance. He had likely taken Whitmore Meridian data before leaving, and Holston Aviation had reopened the contract not because of service failures, but because Gavin had quietly influenced them to do it. She ordered a full investigation into his history at the firm, his email archive, his download records, his activity in the client relationship system, any connected storage devices, any personal accounts accessed on firm equipment, his complete login history, and, in particular, everything he had done in his final week. At the same time, Whitmore Meridian's outside counsel sent formal notices to both Beckett, North and Pierce, and Holston Aviation, stating that the firm had reason to believe a former employee might be making use of confidential client information in an active competitive process. Warren Beckett did not waver. He told Gavin in person that he had made a decision about him 6 months ago and had not seen anything since to change it. But Holston Aviation was running a competitive bid worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and a formal allegation from a bidding firm's counsel was not something their legal department could file away. It had to be examined. And then the investigation found something. In Whitmore Meridian's information technology records, there was an access log under Gavin Mercer's account, showing a large volume of Holston Aviation material accessed during his final days at the firm. The volume was substantial. The timing was, from any distance, extraordinarily bad. Gavin was certain he had not done it, and he said so plainly and immediately. But the log carried his name. Blair sent it to Holston Aviation the same day she received it. She did not commission a technical review first. She did not ask her own information technology group to explain what the entry represented. She forwarded the raw record with a cover note from counsel, and by that evening it was in the hands of Holston's legal department. The bid had entered its final round. 2 firms remained on the shortlist: Whitmore Meridian Group and Beckett, North and Pierce. Gavin was no longer only competing to win an account. He was now defending the only thing he had walked out of that building with. Just over 2 weeks before the final presentation, Holston Aviation called an emergency meeting. Their counsel delivered the position without any hostility, which somehow made it worse. Until the origin of the access log had been independently verified, Gavin Mercer could not participate in the presentation. He could not attend, could not contribute materials, and could not have contact with anyone on the Holston side. And if Beckett, North and Pierce allowed him access to the account regardless, Holston reserved the right to remove the firm from the bid entirely. Warren had to pull him off it. He told Gavin directly in his office that he did not believe the allegation and had not believed it for a moment. But there were hundreds of millions of dollars and the reputation of an entire firm sitting on one side of the decision and a single unverified log entry on the other, and Warren was not able to weigh those things the way he wanted to. Then Beckett's own compliance group added a second layer. Until the review concluded, Gavin was to suspend contact with several other clients as well, as a protective measure. Within a matter of hours, everything he had built since walking into that building began disappearing. His title was still on the door. The authority behind it had been frozen. He came into the office and had nothing he was permitted to work on. Watched meetings he had designed take place without him on the other side of a glass wall, and found that the silence of it was worse than the meeting on the 41st floor had been, because that room had at least been a place where he could speak. Holston did not want him in the building. Whitmore Meridian was describing him, through counsel, as a departing employee who had taken confidential material, and, in an industry small enough that every senior name is known, a rumor began to circulate that Gavin Mercer's sudden success at a competitor had a simple explanation, which was that he had carried something valuable across the street. The worst part was not the accusation itself. The worst part was that Gavin knew he was innocent and could not explain why the system had recorded his own account doing it. He had turned in his laptop. He had surrendered his credentials. He had documented every step of the handover, precisely because he had anticipated something like this, and the very carefulness that was supposed to protect him produced nothing he could use, because the record said what it said. If he could not find the truth before the final presentation, the list of things he stood to lose was no longer abstract. Holston Aviation. The position he had signed for, a reputation built over 8 years, the confidence of an industry with a long memory and very few second chances, and a future he had staked everything on in a corridor on the 41st floor. Blair Whitmore had told him he did not deserve a single cent of bonus. Now she was in a position to make the entire industry believe he had never deserved any of it, from the beginning. Gavin sat alone in an office where his client access had been revoked, looking through the glass at the name on the door. Gavin Mercer, Vice President. For the first time since he had walked out of that conference room, he asked himself whether stepping into that elevator had been the decision that destroyed his entire career. Gavin understood, sitting in that frozen office, that there was no version of this he could win by attacking Blair Whitmore. Any attempt to reframe the accusation as retaliation would be read by Holston Aviation as exactly what a guilty man would say. The only thing that could move a legal department was verification. Warren Beckett put his general counsel and an outside forensic technology team on the entire timeline and gave them one instruction, which was to reconstruct every action taken under Gavin Mercer's account in his final 2 weeks at Whitmore Meridian, without regard to what conclusion it produced. Gavin went back to his own handover documentation while they worked. He read the 19-page transition memo again, and the acknowledgement form he had signed when he surrendered his laptop and credentials, and the confirmation that administrative ownership of the Holston Aviation workspace had been transferred to Carter Voss. That was where the details surfaced. The access log recorded the data activity as having occurred after the point at which Gavin had already completed the transfer of administrative rights over the Holston account. He had signed the transfer. Carter had accepted it. The record of that existed inside Whitmore Meridian's own system, time-stamped, and it sat several hours ahead of the activity the log attributed to him. It was a narrow thing to hang a career on, and he knew it. A transfer confirmation proved only that he no longer owned the workspace, not that he had been unable to reach it, but it was the first fact in 3 weeks that pointed somewhere other than at him, and he sent it to the forensic team that evening, and they went deeper. What they eventually established was that the log entry did not represent a download at all. When an employee's account is closed, Whitmore Meridian's Information Technology Group runs an archival routine that copies the departing user's workspace contents and reassigns ownership of those files to the successor. The volume was large because Gavin's Holston materials were large. The system had recorded his name because the files had originated in his workspace, which was the only place they could have originated. The activity was Whitmore Meridian's own offboarding process, executed by its own information technology group several hours after Gavin had already handed back his credentials and lost the ability to access anything at all. The technical findings ran to more than 40 pages and were unambiguous on every point that mattered. No data had been transmitted outside the Whitmore Meridian environment. No personal device had been connected to any firm system during the period in question. No file originating from Whitmore Meridian had appeared anywhere in Beckett North and Pierce's systems. Gavin had made no contact of any kind with Holston Aviation between his departure and the day the bid was announced, and every element of the Beckett proposal traced to material Holston itself had provided during the current process, exactly as Gavin had committed in writing before the work began. He was clean, completely, and for the first time it was documented by someone other than himself. Holston Aviation lifted the restriction within 48 hours of receiving the report, and their counsel sent a short note stating that the matter was closed and that Gavin Mercer was cleared to participate in the final presentation. What the note could not do was give him back the time. He had been locked out for the better part of 2 weeks in a bid cycle that had no slack in it, and the presentation was days away. On the other side of the table, Blair Whitmore had been preparing the entire time. The final presentation took place in Holston Aviation's boardroom on a Thursday morning, and Blair walked in 10 minutes before the hour with her team behind her and found Gavin already seated across the table. He was not wearing a Whitmore Meridian badge. He was not in a chair placed behind more senior people. The screen at the front of the room displayed the title slide for the second presentation of the morning. Gavin Mercer, Vice President of Strategic Accounts. Whitmore Meridian presented first, and Gavin understood immediately that they would be very difficult to beat on paper. The deck was flawless. The benchmarking was rigorous. The roadmap was detailed to the quarter, and the credentials section carried the weight of a firm that had held this account for years. Blair presented the opening section herself, and she was, as she had always been, extremely good in a room. What the plan did not contain, anywhere in 94 slides, was a person who would be held responsible when something went wrong. Governance was described in terms of committees and escalation paths and steering structures. Every commitment belonged to a function rather than an aim. Gavin presented second. He did not mention the allegation. He did not refer to the access log, or to the 2 weeks he had spent locked out of his own job, or to anything that had happened on the 41st floor of a building 11 blocks away. Nobody in the room heard Blair Whitmore's name from him at any point. He also did not use one line of prior information, and he said so at the beginning, plainly, because it was the fastest way to establish what the next 40 minutes would be built from. What he presented instead was a strategy assembled entirely out of the problems Holston Aviation had described during the bid process itself. He had taken their stated failures and traced them to root causes rather than symptoms, and where he did not have enough information to be certain, he said so and explained what he would need in the first month rather than filling the gap with a confident slide. He proposed a model in which every deliverable, without exception, carried the name of one individual who owned it, along with the escalation path that applied when that individual failed. He put his own name against the first 4. Ellis Crane asked the question near the end, and he asked it directly. What was it, specifically, that Beckett North and Pierce could execute better than a firm that had run this relationship for years and knew the account intimately? Gavin answered without hesitating. Accountability has to belong to a person, not a logo. Holston Aviation moved Beckett North and Pierce into exclusive negotiation 11 days later. The contract was signed the following month. Blair Whitmore's problems did not end with the loss. The Whitmore Meridian Board opened an emergency review into executive compensation practices and client retention, and the first file they requested was Gavin Mercer's. The record was not ambiguous. He had cleared every performance metric in the period under review. His performance rating had been at the top of the internal scale, signed by Blair herself. There was no documented performance justification anywhere in the file for the reduction applied to his bonus. What the review established instead was that Blair had used executive discretion to protect the leadership incentive pool, and that the amount removed from Gavin's compensation had gone toward preserving distributions at a level she had committed to before the quarter closed. Then an email surfaced. Not long after Beckett North and Pierce first approached Gavin, Miles Prescott had written to Blair flagging him as a retention risk. The note was specific. It stated that the approach was believed to be serious and that the firm's exposure on the Holston Aviation account made his continued employment a material issue. Blair's reply was 2 sentences long. Gavin isn't going anywhere. He needs the stability far too much. The board understood the shape of the thing then, and it was not what several of them had assumed. Blair had not undervalued him. She had known precisely what he was worth, which was why Miles had flagged him and why she had answered the way she did. She had made a calculation about his circumstances, decided that a single father would absorb whatever the firm handed him, and priced his compensation against his presumed inability to leave rather than against his contribution. Roland Hayes, who chaired the board, asked 2 questions in the session that followed, and he asked them in sequence. The first was how much Whitmore Meridian had saved by withholding Gavin Mercer's bonus. Miles Prescott gave the figure. The second was how much revenue Whitmore Meridian had lost as a direct consequence of his departure. The second number was larger than the first by a multiple that made the room go quiet. Nobody asked Miles to repeat it. Several of the directors had spent the previous hour treating the matter as a personnel dispute that had been handled clumsily, and the comparison ended that reading permanently, because it converted a question of judgment into a line item. And the figure did not yet include what came next, because within 6 weeks of the Holston decision, 2 additional clients formally requested a review of their relationship with the firm. Blair had to go to Gavin. They met at a coffee shop near Bryant Park because he declined to meet at either office, and she arrived with a proposal she had already cleared with the board. Executive Vice President, a base above what Beckett North and Pierce was paying him, a guaranteed bonus written into the contract rather than left to anyone's discretion, and full authority to rebuild the entire strategic accounts function from the ground up with his own hires. It was, almost precisely, the position Gavin had spent 8 years believing loyalty would eventually earn him. Blair said she wanted to correct a mistake. Gavin asked her which mistake she meant. He asked it without any edge in his voice, and then he laid out the possibilities, because he had come to the meeting knowing he would get exactly 1 opportunity to make her say it. Did she mean withholding the bonus? Did she mean sending an unverified access log to a client's legal department without commissioning a technical review first and letting an industry conclude he was a thief? Or did she mean believing that a single father would tolerate any treatment at all as long as the paycheck kept arriving? Blair looked at the table for a while before she answered. "I underestimated you." Gavin's reply was quiet, and it was the last thing he ever said to her. "No, you knew exactly what I could do. You just underestimated what it was worth." He pushed the offer back across the table, and he did not take it. Whitmore Meridian Group restructured over the following 2 quarters. Blair Whitmore was not removed. The board did something that in some ways cost her more, which was to leave her in the chair while taking away the things the chair had meant. Direct control of client strategy went to a newly created role. Her authority over bonus determinations was capped and made subject to documented performance criteria. A chief operating officer was brought in from outside with a mandate to oversee operations. Decisions she had made alone for years now required review by people who had watched her make one very expensive one. Carter Voss stayed at the firm. Given proper training and given a mentor with the time to explain what the documents did not contain, he developed into a capable account manager over the following year. That outcome mattered because it settled a question the firm had spent months answering incorrectly. Carter had never been the problem. The problem was a system that believed experience could be replaced with a title and that trust could be transferred inside a handover file. Gavin stayed at Beckett North and Pierce. He did not become wealthy in any dramatic sense. He never went back to Whitmore Meridian to enjoy Blair's situation, and he never gave an interview about any of it. And when people in the industry raised the access log, he told them the forensic report was available and changed the subject. The victory never turned into revenge because he had never actually wanted revenge. He had wanted to walk into rooms where his responsibility came with the authority and the respect that were supposed to accompany it. And now he did. Months later, in a first meeting with a new client, one of their executives asked the question clients always eventually ask, which was, who would be directly accountable for their account? Warren Beckett did not point at the firm's name on the wall. He looked across the table at Gavin. He does. At the end of that day, Gavin walked toward the elevators, the same chime, the same brushed metal doors closing on the same reflection of a man in a suit holding a folder. What he was not carrying was a compensation sheet telling him he did not deserve a single cent of bonus. He was carrying a title that matched the work he actually did, a reputation that had survived a formal accusation and come out documented, and a future that no longer depended on whether Blair Whitmore was willing to acknowledge what he was worth. She had told him he did not deserve a single cent. Then she had come close to destroying his name in the attempt to prove that he could not succeed without her firm behind him. What Gavin proved instead was the opposite, and he proved it in her own client's boardroom, using nothing but what he was. His value had never been located in the building where he worked. It had always been in him. Never use a person's circumstances to measure how much unfairness they will absorb. Loyalty is not a license to discount what someone is worth. And sometimes, what a person needs most is not to be paid more to stay, but the courage to walk out of the place that made them forget their own value.